Okay, I'm going to start going over the essay points so you can get full points on the essay. Probably the best thing about the essay is to be able to write a practice essay before you actually take the test. That normally that's the expectation for the review sheet, but it also helps with um, overall um, doing on the essay. So um, their unique histories. How were the North and South alike or different in their unique histories? Well, they both disagreed on slavery. So after the American Revolution, we really see a divide between the North and the South on slavery. So the Southern states began for slavery and the Northern against slavery. Um, so when we look at the Northern states, we can document that they ended slavery starting in 1800. Um, but um, even though they viewed them as inferior, they still gave them freedom. Um, and you could also write about the history being kind of like the culture part, um, that even though slaves were in the South and um, normally businesses were in the North, that doesn't mean that there were sympathizers on both sides. That would be another good thing to mention. Now, when we look at the North and the South, they have a difference in economies. So some of the things that we might mention when we talk about economies is New York or North is going to have a lot more um, cities and factories, industries, and the South is going to be an agriculture society. The main crop is going to be cash crops, mostly labor intensive. Um, Cotton itself is labor intensive, but there's also sugar and tobacco that are cash crops. Um, we look at Southern economy. There was like a large upper class in the South. You don't find that in the North. The North was had more. I mean, there was still an upper class, but not like this entire class of people like we have in the South. Um, we also have when we look at economies between the North and the South. You can look at railroads, factories, population. Those types of things are um, things that we can compare and contrast the North and the South. They're going to have more money in the North, less money in the South, more technology. When we start getting into comparing and contrasting the North and South, you can, you know, definitely the economies kind of overlap the strengths and weaknesses. So if we focus on the strengths and weaknesses of the North and the South, we know that if we look at the North, primarily the strength of the North was its technology, its factories, its cities, its money supply. The population was more, telegraph lines were more, railroads were more. Those are all strengths of the North. The other thing that the North had was an established government. They have an established army and navy. They have Abraham Lincoln. Some of the weaknesses of the North is that they were less committed to the war. They also um, struggled to have a good military general. Another thing that the North is going to would be considered a weakness, I guess, would be the fight offensively. They had to actually go down and defend forts on the South land that was in their own territory, the South territory, not on their own land. We look at the strengths of the South. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson are great military leaders. They're much better than what the North has. When we look at um, the South was fighting on their own land, so they had more commitment to the fight. They also are going to have the advantage of fighting defensively, because in that way you're able to um, defend rather than have to put the work and effort in offensive and moving supplies. You could write the defensive part of the South and the offensive part of the North as a strength or a weakness, as long as you argue your point there. Now, when we look at the weaknesses of the South, they had no established government, they had no established navy or army. They had to take over other ships and forts in order to get their ammunition. Another weakness was they had very little money. They had limited population to serve because a lot of their population um, was, for sure, a lot of slaves. So you can't, I mean, you don't use those in the military like others. Um, if we look at the treatment of African Americans, this focuses on the Reconstruction. How did the South and the North treat African Americans? So, in the North, most African Americans enjoyed relatively the freedoms that were guaranteed to them in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The right of being free, the right of citizenship, and the right to vote. Now, when we look at how the South treated them, many people moved to the North because of the freedom that was there. Even though they had freedom in the North, many times they still were not able to serve in, like, it was hard to get a quote good job. So many times they worked labor jobs. Um, Many of them will attempt to go to college, but most of the time in the beginning they're going to be encouraged to do like kind of like a tech school route rather than an academic route, which is going to take the African Americans out of some realms of society, like professors and leaders and politicians. So in the North, there was still prejudice and racism. It was kind of embedded, and it was more connected with social and economic class than it was race. In the South, Southerners slowly took political control away from African Americans after um, the radical Republicans began to um, dwindle in the South. Um, the Redeemers, they were the politicians that wanted to redeem the South in the eyes of Congress. So after the Compromise of 1877, we basically kind of have a blind eye turned to the South. Women does not have the right to vote. Um, and the southern states ignored the 15th Amendment and began to pass restrictive laws. Laws such as a literacy test. You had to test so that you could vote. A grandfather clause. You could vote without restriction as long as your grandfather had voted before the Civil War. This allowed poor whites to vote when there was poll tax, so they didn't have to pay the poll tax if their grandfather had voted before the Civil War. Definitely attempting to make sure African Americans did not vote. And then poll tax itself. Sometimes it was lynching. Um, Sometimes it was other things that they scared African Americans into not resisting and not working for their civil rights. Now there's going to be civil rights acts passed. There's going to be enforcement acts during the Reconstruction, but overall, that is how the African Americans were treated after the Civil War. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about military strategies. I realized I left this off my original one, so I wanted to add it here. Military strategies is another piece that you'll talk about in comparing and contrasting the North and South. And that is basically the North was offense, the South was defense. The North had the military strategy of the Anaconda Plan: blockade the eastern seaboard, take the port of New Orleans, move up the Mississippi, and cut the Confederacy in half. Remember, Vicksburg was one of the ones that stopped the control of the Mississippi River, but that becomes a part of the plan to win the war. The Anaconda Plan did not change. Squeeze the life out of the South, and it worked. Now, on the Southern, their idea was to continue to fight and fight long enough until the North got tired of war. And it almost worked because after 4 years, I mean, the end of the war is what everyone wanted. So when the North wants to get to the end of the war, they implement a new strategy called total war. In addition to the Anaconda Plan, they use total war, which attacks civilian and military targets to break the will of the people to fight. Total war burns down buildings and factories and um, destroys homes in order to try and break the back of the people. So you can look at these strategies. Now, the South strategy was very simple: last it out, wear them out, fight defense. And the North had, total war and the Anaconda plan. You should mention all three of those if you would like full points for military strategies. Now, I've talked about a lot of things about the essay, and I know I kind of go really fast, and you might be pausing the video, trying to write stuff down. Um, you need to make sure your essay is complete. Essay is worth 30 points on this test. That means if you don't write anything on the essay, you automatically have a 70% if you got every multiple choice question correct, which would be a barely passing grade. Most likely getting every question right, would be kind of hard. So that essay has a lot of points weighing on it. So I want you to make sure that you focus on that. There's only 35 multiple choice and one essay, but putting the extra time into the essay is very important. I hope you can use this video. If you have specific questions, we'll be answering those on Tuesday before the test, but hopefully this can help you study.